In the stillness before dawn, when mist curls around the mountains of old Japan, a quiet figure kneels in the garden. The sound of wind brushes the bamboo leaves, and for a moment the world holds its breath. He is calm. His hands rest upon the hilt of a blade that has never known haste. For him, the sword is not a weapon, it is a mirror. It reflects the soul of the one who wields it. For nearly 1,000 years, such men and women walked the islands of Japan. They were servants, protectors, poets, and thinkers. They lived by a code of silence and devotion, a path known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Their story is not one of battle or conquest, but of duty, discipline, and the endless search for balance between strength and peace. It is a story written in ink and steel, in loyalty, and in the fleeting beauty of falling cherry blossoms. Tonight, we travel back through the mists of time to a world where honor was a language and silence could be louder than war. From the rise of the first clans to the final twilight of the samurai, this is the journey of Japan's warrior spirit, a story of devotion, impermanence, and the quiet strength of the human heart. Let us begin with the birth of the samurai. In the heart of ancient Japan, long before the word samurai was known, the land was ruled not by warriors, but by poets. It was the Heian period, a time when beauty was power and grace was the language of the court. In Kyoto, the capital shone with quiet elegance. Nobles wrote poems about dew on the morning grass and exchanged letters scented with incense. They played music beneath lanterns and discussed the color of the moon. It was a world that seemed untouched by time. But beyond the capital's shimmering gates, the countryside told a different story. Far from the soft glow of the emperor's palace, the provinces were wild and uncertain. The fields were wide, the forests deep, and power lay not in poetry, but in strength. Local lords struggled to maintain order in lands that stretched far beyond the emperor's reach. Bandits roamed the roads, and small villages built walls of bamboo to protect themselves from the chaos of the outside world. It was here, between beauty and hardship, between refinement and survival, that a new class of men began to rise. They were not born of noble blood, yet they served those who were. They rode horses through misted valleys and carried bows of polished wood. They lived by a simple truth: to protect is to serve. And from that truth came their name samurai, the ones who serve. In the beginning, these warriors were humble. They guarded estates, escorted caravans, and maintained the peace in a land that was slowly forgetting what peace meant. But over generations, their skill and discipline set them apart. They trained not only their bodies, but their minds, for they believed that a warrior's calm must be deeper than his strength. Even before their name was spoken with reverence, the spirit of the samurai had already begun to take shape. The great families of the age, the Taira and the Minamoto, soon discovered the power these men held. At first, they employed them as retainers, loyal to the clan above all else. But as the clans grew stronger, their warriors became the foundation of something greater. They were no longer servants of the nobles in Kyoto. They were warriors of the land itself. The Taira ruled the western provinces, close to the sea, their banners carried by the wind along the coast. The Minamoto held the mountain roads of the east, known for their discipline and endurance. Their rivalry began quietly, with politics and pride, but soon it grew into something larger, a struggle that would decide who held the soul of Japan. In those days, battle was not yet the endless roar of war it would later become. It was a ritual of courage, guided by custom. Warriors announced their names before striking, believing that honor mattered more than victory. They wore armor of lacquered plates, tied with silk, light enough to move like shadows through the tall grass. They carried bows taller than themselves, and swords curved like the crescent moon. In the year 1180, the tension between Taira and Minamoto finally broke. The islands burned with conflict, temples fell silent, and the once gentle songs of the court were replaced by the thunder of hooves. For 5 long years, Japan was divided. But even in this chaos, there was a sense of purpose, for the warriors believed that their struggle was guided by heaven's will. The final act came upon the sea at a place called Dan no Ura. The waves were restless that morning, the wind cold and sharp. The Taira, proud and desperate, faced the advancing Minamoto fleets. When the sun set, the sea carried away an empire. The Taira were gone, their banners sinking beneath the water, and from the ashes of their fall, a new age was born. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the victor, did not return to Kyoto. He chose instead to rule from the coastlands of Kamakura, far from the glitter of the court, close to the spirit of the warriors who had brought him to power. His decision marked the beginning of something unprecedented, a government led not by nobles or priests, but by men of the sword. The emperor would still sit upon the throne, but his power would become a symbol. The true rule would belong to the shogun, the general who led through discipline and strength. It was a quiet revolution, and with it, Japan stepped into a new chapter of its history. The samurai had risen. They were no longer the shadows of the nobility. They were the heart of a new order. They brought with them a way of life built on clarity, loyalty, and control, a belief that life itself was a lesson in balance. To fight without anger, to live without fear, to die without regret. Even in their earliest days, they understood that true mastery was not found in the act of battle, but in the stillness that came before it. When a warrior stood alone beneath the moon, hand resting on the hilt of his blade, he faced not his enemy, but his own reflection. The age of the poets had ended. The age of the warriors had begun. Before the rise of great clans and distant wars, before the thunder of drums and the banners of conquest, there was a quieter world, the daily rhythm of the samurai's life. It was not a life of constant battle, but of constant awareness. Every sunrise, every gesture, every breath carried the weight of purpose. A samurai's day began before the light touched the horizon. He rose from his mat while the world was still half in dream. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and the faint sound of running water. He knelt, facing the direction of the morning sun, and began his meditation. For him, calmness was not a luxury, it was armor. Stillness was the foundation on which strength was built. After meditation came practice. In the courtyard of his home, the samurai drew his sword in one smooth motion, the art of Ai-jutsu. To draw, to strike, to return the blade, all in the span of a single breath, not for killing, but for discipline. The edge of the sword was sharp, but sharper still was the mind that guided it. He practiced with the bow, to the yumi, taller than a man and made from bamboo and silk. Each arrow released was an act of mindfulness. Before the string was drawn, the samurai's focus had already found its mark. The body followed where the spirit had already gone. Breakfast was simple rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables. To eat was not to indulge, but to renew. Even in food, there was awareness. gratitude for the farmer, the earth, and the unseen hands that had made the meal possible. Afterward came study. The sword and the scroll were equals in the house of a true samurai. He read poetry, philosophy, and strategy. He copied passages from Chinese texts, learning from the thoughts of the ancients. Knowledge was another kind of weapon, one that shaped the heart more than the hand. In the afternoon, he tended to his duties. Some served as guards, some as messengers, others as administrators of land. Whatever his task, it was done with care and precision. The value of a samurai was measured not in what he commanded, but in how he carried himself. Even the smallest act, opening a gate, writing a letter, bowing to a guest, was done as though the eyes of his ancestors were upon him. Honor was not a word spoken often, but it lived in everything. It was there, in the way he greeted his wife with a bow, in the way he treated his servants with respect, in the way he spoke only when necessary. He knew that the tone of his voice could reveal more than the words themselves. Restraint was not weakness, it was mastery. When evening came, he trained again, this time not with blade or bow, but with awareness. He walked through his garden slowly, observing the stones, the shadows, the sound of the wind moving through bamboo. Each moment was a lesson in impermanence. The flower that bloomed today would fall tomorrow. So too would every life, every victory, every sorrow. At sunset, he removed his armor and placed it carefully in its box. Each piece was wiped clean, not because it was dirty, but because it deserved respect. The armor was not just protection, it was memory. It held the sweat, the effort, the breath of countless days of training. Night was a time for reflection. By candlelight, the samurai might write a short poem, a waka or haiku, capturing a single thought or feeling, perhaps about the moon above the pine trees, perhaps about the quiet sound of rain on the roof. These were not poems for others to read, but mirrors for the self. Before sleep, he bowed once more, not to a god, but to the invisible order of the world, the path that connected all things. He knew that tomorrow would come with its own tests, of patience, of judgment, of restraint. And so he rested, not in luxury, but in readiness. The samurai's life was not one of glory. It was a life of rhythm, like the pulse of a heartbeat, steady and true. Every motion, every silence, every word carried meaning. He understood that mastery did not lie in great deeds, but in the perfection of small ones. To live with that awareness was to live the true way of the warrior, not as a conqueror, but as a student of life. And when the dawn came again, breaking through the mists of another morning, he would rise once more, to meditate, to serve, to practice, and to live with quiet honor. The victory of the Minamoto clan at Dan no Ira marked more than the end of a war. It was the quiet beginning of a new kind of Japan, one led not by the grace of nobles, but by the discipline of warriors. From the mist of that transformation rose Minamoto no Yoritomo, a man who understood that the sword could not only protect, but also govern. Far from the old capital of Kyoto, he built his home in Kamakura, a coastal town surrounded by green hills and salt wind. Here, in a place untouched by the politics of the court, he founded a government led by warriors for warriors, the Bakufu, the military rule. The emperor remained a divine figure, but the shogun held the true power. It was a silent shift, almost invisible to those beyond the court, yet it changed Japan forever. In Kamakura, the air was different. Gone were the silks, the perfumes, and the polished words of Kyoto. Life here was simple, harsh, and honest. The samurai rose before dawn, trained with their bows and blades, and studied the lessons of self-restraint. They valued endurance over luxury, obedience over ambition. Their homes were built of wood and thatch, their hearts of iron and quiet devotion. The early samurai code was not yet called Bushido, but its essence already lived within them. A warrior's life was built upon three pillars: loyalty, courage, and honor. Loyalty bound him to his lord, as surely as his armor bound him to his duty. Courage guided his steps through uncertainty, not as recklessness, but as calm acceptance of fate. And honor, unseen yet unbreakable, was the invisible thread that tied all things together. In this new age, religion and philosophy blended into something unique. From the mainland came the teachings of Zen Buddhism, a way of silence, clarity, and balance. The samurai embraced it not as dogma, but as practice. Through meditation, they sought stillness in the chaos of duty. They learned that a clear mind was sharper than any blade. To control one's thoughts was to control one's destiny. Zen temples began to rise near Kamakura, their gardens carefully arranged in patterns of sand and stone. Each stone represented a mountain, each ripple a wave. To sit before them in meditation was to gaze upon the simplicity of the universe itself. The sword became a companion to the spirit, polished, not for battle, but for reflection. The monks taught that enlightenment could be found in a single breath, a single movement, or even a single moment of awareness. This philosophy resonated deeply with the warrior class. The samurai began to understand that the true enemy was not the one standing before them, but the one within the restless mind, the untamed ego, the fear of impermanence. Yet even as the samurai turned inward, storms gathered beyond the sea. To the west, the vast empire of the Mongols stretched across Asia. Their emperor, Kublai Khan, demanded tribute from Japan, and when it was refused, he sent his armies to conquer the islands. In 1274, ships appeared on the horizon. They carried thousands of soldiers across the dark waters. The samurai met them on the beaches of Kyushu, where waves broke against the armored line of defenders. They fought not only for land, but for identity, the first test of the new Japan. The invasion was fierce, yet before it could claim victory, a storm swept across the sea. Winds tore through the enemy fleet, scattering ships like leaves upon the water. The samurai watched as nature itself rose to defend their homeland. 7 years later, the Mongols returned, stronger, with an even greater armada. Again, the warriors prepared. Again, the skies darkened, and once more, the sea turned wild. The typhoon that followed destroyed nearly every vessel, leaving the invaders helpless. The people called it Kamikaze, the divine wind. The word became legend, and for generations, it symbolized Japan's unseen protection, a reminder that even the strongest must bow to forces beyond control. For the samurai, it was also a lesson in humility. Power, no matter how great, exists only by the grace of balance. After the invasions, the Kamakura shogunate was celebrated, but its strength began to wane. Defending the coast had drained the nation's wealth. Clans demanded reward for their service, but there was little to give. The seeds of discontent began to grow. Lords questioned their allegiance. Samurai began to drift from one master to another, seeking meaning and livelihood. As the 14th century dawned, Japan once again stood on uncertain ground. The court in Kyoto still claimed divine authority, and new military leaders sought to restore it. Conflict erupted, and the balance Yoritomo had built began to crack. The first age of the shoguns was ending. But even as governments fell, the samurai spirit endured. The lessons of Kamakura, simplicity, loyalty, and the calm found through discipline, remained like ink that cannot be washed away. They had learned that strength does not come from conquest, but from clarity. The warrior's heart, once a servant of the emperor, had become something more, a reflection of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between duty and desire. Through meditation, they had found purpose. Through loss, they had found truth. And through silence, they had discovered the beginning of a philosophy that would define Japan for centuries. The age of Kamakura faded into memory, but its echoes continued to shape every blade drawn, every oath spoken, and every breath taken in the centuries to come. A new era was rising, one of ambition, turmoil, and transformation. The samurai, once united by peace, would soon be divided by war, and in that chaos, their true nature would be revealed. Behind every warrior who carried the sword stood another kind of strength, quieter, unseen, but no less powerful. The women of the samurai world were the still water beneath the surface of a storm. They did not wear armor, yet they held together the very order that the sword was meant to protect. In the wooden homes of the warrior class, where the smell of incense mingled with the rustle of silk, women learned from an early age that dignity was not something granted but practiced. They rose before the sun, just as their husbands and sons did, and began the rituals of the day, cleaning, preparing food, arranging flowers in silent meditation. Every gesture was deliberate, every action performed with awareness. In stillness, they found strength. Education was not denied to them. A samurai woman was expected to read, to write, and to understand poetry and philosophy. She learned the art of conversation, of restraint, of calm authority. In her husband's absence, which was often, she managed the household, the servants, the finances, and sometimes the entire estate. Her word carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was measured. Mothers taught their children not only how to speak, but how to bow, how to listen, how to wait before answering. They taught the boys discipline and the girls composure. A single phrase, spoken softly, could become a lifelong lesson. A single look could convey pride, disappointment, or love. This was the invisible art of the samurai household, mastery of the self, mirrored in every relationship. And though they rarely appeared in history's pages, samurai women knew the way of the warrior. Many were trained in the use of the naginata, a long curved blade mounted on a staff. It was a weapon of grace and precision, meant not for conquest, but for defense of the home, of the family, of honor itself. In times of danger, they stood at the gates while their husbands fought far away, embodying the same courage that defined the men of their class. But their greatest weapon was patience. When wars dragged on and the seasons passed without word, they held the family together with quiet faith. They managed the harvest, cared for the elders, and prepared for every possibility, victory or loss. They understood impermanence more deeply than anyone, because they lived with it every day. Letters from the battlefield often began with apologies. Men wrote to the women they left behind, promising to return, thanking them for their strength, for their calm, for their silence. The words were simple, but between the lines was reverence not for submission, but for endurance. They knew that without these women, the spirit of the warrior could not survive. In peaceful times, they became guardians of culture. They practiced ikebana, the art of arranging flowers, not for beauty alone, but as a form of meditation. A single branch, placed just so, could express the cycle of life and death. They practiced the tea ceremony with the same precision as their husbands practiced the sword. Their movements were slow, deliberate, elegant, the embodiment of calm under pressure. Some became poets. Their verses spoke not of war, but of waiting, of the sound of rain against the shutters, of longing that was not sorrow but understanding. One wrote, "The wind carries his voice, faint as memory. I answer with silence, and the silence answers back." In that silence lay devotion not only to their husbands, but to the path itself. They too lived by Bushido, though their service took a different form. For them, honor was found in perseverance, humility, and grace. To endure hardship without complaint was the truest expression of strength. When a husband died in battle, the woman of his house did not weep in public. She bowed, she thanked the heavens for his service, and then she continued the work of living. In her composure, the clan found its dignity. In her silence, the household found its stability. Generations later, when the wars had ended and peace filled the land, the spirit of these women did not fade. They raised children who would grow to be teachers, poets, scholars, and philosophers. Their restraint became the model for a nation's etiquette. Their calmness, its quiet pride, they were the unseen architects of Japan's moral foundation, the keepers of harmony, the guardians of patience. To speak of the samurai is to speak of them also. Without their presence, the sword would have no purpose, the home no balance, the soul no rest. They were the breath between each strike, the heartbeat between each command. They were the reflection of everything the samurai sought to be: poised, disciplined, and unshakably devoted to a life lived with honor. Even now, their echo endures. In the soft bow of a hostess welcoming a guest, in the care of a mother guiding her child, in the quiet strength of a woman who carries grace through hardship. Their legacy is not written in steel, but in silence, and like silence, it cannot be broken, only felt. The calm of Kamakura had passed into memory. By the 15th century, Japan stood once more divided not by foreign threat, but by itself. The shogunate, weakened and uncertain, no longer commanded the respect it once held. Local lords, called daimyo, turned their eyes toward power, each building his own army of loyal retainers. Samurai, who had long lived by service, now found themselves caught in a storm without a master. The land fractured into 1,000 ambitions. Castles rose on mountain tops, their watchtowers glinting like distant stars. Fields were fortified. Alliances were made and broken like the changing of seasons. The emperor's voice grew faint, the shogun's word ignored. It was an age of restless change, an age called Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states. For over a century, Japan became a chessboard of shifting power. Every province had its warlord, every warlord his code, and every samurai his test of loyalty. Honor still mattered, but survival had become a skill of its own. In this new reality, warriors had to balance two worlds, the ideal of Bushido and the reality of endless conflict. Yet even amid the chaos, beauty remained. Poems were still written, cherry blossoms still bloomed. Before every campaign, samurai wrote letters of farewell to their families, not in despair, but in acceptance. To them, impermanence was not tragedy, it was truth. Out of this storm rose three names that would come to define the destiny of Japan. The first was Oda Nobunaga, a man born to destroy before he could create. He was unlike any who came before him, bold, unorthodox, and unyielding. Where others clung to old traditions, Nobunaga saw only obstacles. He stripped away the ancient rituals of war and replaced them with something new: discipline, speed, innovation. When foreign traders arrived with strange new weapons that thundered with smoke and fire, Nobunaga saw their potential. He trained his soldiers to use them not as curiosities, but as instruments of precision. The matchlock gun changed the rhythm of battle forever, but Nobunaga's genius went beyond war. He understood that unity could not be achieved by fear alone. He welcomed merchants, encouraged art, and opened roads that had long been closed. His dream was not simply to conquer Japan, but to reshape it. Still, ambition burns bright and brief. In the end, betrayal came not from his enemies, but from within his own ranks. His fire was extinguished before the dream could be complete. From the ashes of that dream rose Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was not born to nobility, nor trained in luxury. He began as a servant, humble and unnoticed, a man of cleverness and tireless resolve. Where Nobunaga's power came from innovation, Hideyoshi's came from people. He built alliances with care, turned enemies into allies, and spoke to farmers and scholars with equal respect. Through patience and strategy, he achieved what no one before him had done. He united nearly all of Japan under one rule. Under Hideyoshi, the swords of the nation finally rested. He brought peace to the provinces, rebuilt cities, and redefined the structure of power. He created laws that bound the classes. Farmers would farm, craftsmen would craft, and samurai would serve. He wanted stability to last beyond his lifetime. Yet as he grew older, his peace began to tremble beneath the weight of his ambition. He dreamed of conquest beyond Japan's shores, of a legacy that would stretch across seas. But fate does not reward every dream. He left behind unity, but also uncertainty, and in that space, a new figure waited in silence. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the last of the three, patient where Nobunaga had been bold, deliberate where Hideyoshi had been daring. He watched, learned, and waited. When the time came, he moved with calm precision. In the year 1600, the armies of Japan gathered on the misty plains of Sekigahara. The air was thick with fog and unspoken prayers. Thousands stood ready, each man knowing that the dawn would decide the fate of the nation. When the mist lifted, the armies clashed, but beneath the chaos, Tokugawa's discipline prevailed. By dusk, Japan had a new master. The battle ended centuries of division, and with it, the age of the warring states came to its quiet close. Tokugawa did not seek glory in his victory. Instead, he sought permanence. He built a system that would outlast him, one of strict order and peace. The capital was moved to Edo, where wooden bridges crossed silent rivers, and the rhythm of life slowed to the pace of duty. He sealed the borders of Japan, closing the nation to the outside world. Foreign ships were turned away, and the islands became a world unto themselves. For the samurai, this new peace was both reward and test. They had fought for generations, lived and died for causes greater than themselves. Now, their swords hung unused, their purpose fading with every quiet dawn. Some turned to study, others to poetry or governance. A few became wanderers, searching for meaning in the stillness of peace. In this silence, the samurai spirit began to evolve. Bushido became not a code of war, but a philosophy of life, an inner journey toward mastery, humility, and self-understanding. The sword, once drawn in battle, now reflected the warrior's soul. The calm that followed chaos became the new test of discipline. As the smoke of the past cleared, Japan stood united for the first time in its history. Yet the question remained, what becomes of the warrior when there is no war? What does honor mean when there are no enemies left to face? The answer would unfold in the centuries that followed. In an age of peace, unlike any before it, when the samurai turned inward and the sword became a mirror for the mind. The fire of Sengoku had burned away the old world. From its ashes, something quieter, purer, and deeper would rise. There was a time when the sword was everything, the mark of rank, the keeper of peace, the measure of a man. But as the years passed and the sound of battle faded into silence, the sword began to change. It ceased to be an instrument of survival and became instead a vessel for spirit. Its steel no longer cut through flesh, but through illusion. It became art, and in its making and its mastery, Japan found its soul. The forging of a sword was a sacred act. In a dim workshop deep in the mountains, a master smith worked in solitude. His hammer fell with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Each strike was a prayer, each spark a fragment of devotion. He folded the metal again and again, sometimes thousands of times, until the impurities were burned away. Between the heat and the water, between the breath and the silence, something alive began to form. The blade was not merely made, it was born. When the final shape appeared, it shone like a frozen flame. The line that ran along its edge, the hamon, was the signature of its soul. No two were ever the same. Some rippled like waves on a quiet sea, others shimmered like clouds at dawn. To gaze upon that pattern was to glimpse the invisible dialogue between fire and calm, between chaos and order. To hold such a sword was to hold balance itself. The samurai believed that their weapon carried a spirit, not a ghost, but a mirror. It reflected the purity of its owner. A blade drawn in anger dulled the heart. A blade drawn in awareness revealed truth. To polish a sword was to polish one's thoughts. To sharpen it was to refine one's purpose. In peaceful times, the sword left the battlefield and entered the realm of art. Swordsmiths became philosophers, calligraphers, and poets of steel. They spoke of harmony, not victory. Collectors treated blades as living beings, giving them names, caring for them as one would for a beloved instrument. Even those who no longer carried a weapon still bowed before it in respect. The sword also found its reflection in the arts of the spirit. In Shodo, the way of calligraphy, the same precision applied. The brush moved like a blade, quick, decisive, irretrievable. One stroke carried everything: intent, rhythm, emptiness. There could be no hesitation, no correction. The ink flowed as life itself did, unrepeatable. In Ikebana, the art of arranging flowers, the samurai found the same truth. A single branch placed at the right angle could express harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Each petal was a moment of awareness. Each arrangement, a meditation on transience. The sword and the flower, opposites in form, were one in spirit. In painting, too, the same line could divide or unite worlds. Artists used ink the way warriors use steel, with restraint and understanding. To leave a space blank was as meaningful as to fill it. The samurai who studied art learned that emptiness was not absence, but potential, that a line drawn with intention could be sharper than a blade. And so, the sword found its place not in conquest, but in creation. It became a symbol of the path towards self-mastery, the eternal dialogue between strength and stillness. Even Zen monks spoke of it. One wrote, "The perfect sword is not drawn. The perfect stroke is not made. The perfect spirit moves without motion." In the dojos of Edo, warriors continued to train. But their training was no longer a preparation for war, it was a meditation. Each cut, each stance, each controlled breath was a prayer in motion. To draw the sword without ego, to move without waste, that was the goal. Victory was no longer over an opponent, but over the restless self. The blade, the brush, the tea whisk, the flute, all became paths to the same truth. They led to the center of being, where silence meets awareness. The samurai learned that to master the sword was to master the art of living. To hold it with humility was to understand that power means nothing without purpose. Even centuries later, that lesson endures. The sword remains in museums and shrines, polished and gleaming beneath the soft light. Visitors bow before it, not in fear, but in reverence. For within that narrow length of steel lies the story of a people, the transformation of violence into beauty, of duty into wisdom. The sword still waits in silence, balanced perfectly between light and shadow. It asks no questions, gives no commands. It simply exists pure, poised, complete. And in that stillness, the spirit of the samurai continues to live. When the smoke of Sekigahara faded, the air over Japan became still once more. The endless thunder of war that had shaken the islands for centuries was replaced by the soft rhythm of daily life. Under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his descendants, the land entered a peace so deep and enduring that it reshaped the very soul of the nation. For the first time in living memory, an entire generation grew up without hearing the sound of marching armies. Edo, the new capital, rose beside the quiet waters of its bay, its wooden streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and families. The river carried barges heavy with rice and silk. Cherry trees lined the roads, blooming each spring like clouds of pale fire. Here, a new Japan emerged orderly, measured, and self-contained. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled through discipline and design. Every class had its place, and every person their duty. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a distant symbol of divine heritage, but real power flowed through the hands of the shogun and his council of advisors. The great lords were required to serve in Edo for part of each year, leaving their families behind as quiet hostages of loyalty. This system of balance held the nation together for more than 200 years. For the samurai, the change was profound. They had lived for generations by the blade, their worth measured in courage and sacrifice. Now, their swords hung untouched in the dim light of their homes. The peace they had fought to create had made their purpose uncertain, yet the true strength of the samurai was never only in battle. It was in discipline, the ability to adapt, to serve, and to find meaning in duty itself. And so they transformed. Many became scholars, teachers, and administrators. They studied law and governance, philosophy, and poetry. Their service shifted from the field to the mind. Out of this transformation grew a new understanding of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was no longer a code of combat, but a guide to living. It taught that true victory was not over an opponent, but over oneself. That mastery of the sword was meaningless without mastery of the spirit. That loyalty, honesty, and humility were weapons stronger than steel. The samurai began to study Zen more deeply than ever before. In its silence, they found peace. In its teachings, they found clarity. A single brushstroke in calligraphy became as sacred as the arc of a blade. A pause between breaths could reveal the nature of the universe. Meditation was their new battleground, self-awareness, their victory. Their homes were simple tatami mats, sliding paper doors, small gardens raked into waves of white sand. Each element served a purpose. Each line was deliberate. To live without excess became an art form of its own. Through restraint, beauty was revealed. The tea ceremony became a ritual of perfection and humility. In a small, quiet room, host and guest knelt as equals. Every movement was precise: the folding of a cloth, the turn of a cup, the sound of water poured into a bowl. It was a meditation in motion, a reminder that even the simplest act, done with sincerity, could hold the weight of eternity. The samurai also turned to art. They painted landscapes that mirrored the flow of thought, mountains fading into mist, rivers winding endlessly toward the sea. They wrote haiku that captured single moments with the depth of entire lives. A falling leaf, the cry of a distant bird, the silence before rain. These were no longer mere images, they were reflections of being. Among the most revered of these new warriors was Miyamoto Musashi, a swordsman whose skill was matched only by his insight. After countless duels and years of solitude, he wrote the Book of Five Rings, a meditation on conflict, balance, and perception. He taught that victory is achieved not by strength, but by understanding that one must see everything, even the unseen. Musashi's words became a mirror through which generations of samurai examined their own souls. As peace deepened, families of samurai passed down more than weapons. They passed down values. Fathers taught sons not only how to wield the sword, but how to speak with honesty, how to serve with grace, how to endure with quiet pride. Women of samurai families, though often unseen in history, embodied the same spirit. They managed households with dignity, taught discipline to their children, and preserved the essence of Bushido in times of peace. But even within this harmony, a shadow grew. Centuries of order began to harden into stagnation. The shogunate's isolation from the world that once protected Japan now confined it. While other nations advanced with new ideas and discoveries, Japan's eyes remained turned inward. The samurai, too, began to feel the weight of stillness. For every man trained to serve, idleness was a quiet sorrow. Many fell into poverty, as their stipends failed to keep pace with the growing economy. Some became teachers, others wanderers. A few sought enlightenment in simplicity, living as monks or hermits. Yet through it all, they kept their composure. Even when life offered little, they faced it with calm acceptance. For the true path of the warrior was not victory, but virtue. To stand straight even when the world tilts, that was their art. The Edo period became one of Japan's most beautiful eras, a time when peace itself was perfected into an aesthetic. Gardens, poetry, theater, and craftsmanship reached new heights, and at the center of it all stood the quiet figure of the samurai, now less a soldier than a symbol, a reminder of balance in a world forever changing. But beyond the coasts of Japan, winds had begun to shift. New powers were rising, and their sails were already catching the storms of industry and empire. The age of isolation, which had protected the islands for centuries, would soon come to an end, and when it did, the samurai once again would find themselves standing between the old world and the new. For more than 200 years, the islands of Japan drifted in a calm dream. The world beyond their shores grew louder, filled with engines, factories, and ships of iron, but within the boundaries of the shogunate, time seemed to stand still. Seasons changed, cherry blossoms bloomed and fell, and the rhythm of life moved like a slow river, constant and unbroken. Yet all rivers, no matter how peaceful, eventually meet the sea, and in the middle of the 19th century, that sea arrived in the form of dark smoke on the horizon. In the summer of 1853, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. They moved like mountains of iron, breathing clouds of fire. Their cannons pointed toward the quiet capital. At their helm was an American officer, Commodore Matthew Perry, bringing with him a message that could not be ignored. The world had come knocking on Japan's closed gate. The Tokugawa government, unprepared and uncertain, faced an impossible choice: open the nation to the foreigners or face their power. The shogunate, built on centuries of control, began to fracture under the weight of the decision. Old factions whispered of defiance, young ones of change. For the first time in generations, the still surface of Japan's peace began to tremble. The treaties that followed opened the ports to foreign ships and trade. They also opened the eyes of the Japanese people to a world that had moved far ahead. Steam trains, rifles, telegraphs. These things seemed to belong to another age entirely, and in the silence that followed, the samurai felt something deeper than shock. They felt the earth shifting beneath their feet. For centuries, they had been the guardians of Japan's spirit, the moral and social backbone of the nation. But now, their place in the new world was uncertain. The government sought modernization, building factories and adopting the ways of the West. Feudal ranks were dissolved, and with them, the privileges of the samurai class. Their stipends were reduced, their right to bear swords abolished. The katana, once the symbol of their identity, was now seen as a relic of the past. In the streets of Edo, now renamed Tokyo, former warriors walked in silence, their long hair cut short, their armor sold to survive. They watched as young men without lineage rose to positions of power through study and innovation. The new era was built on ideas, not loyalty, and for many samurai, that realization felt like exile in their own homeland. Some adapted. They became teachers, officers, and statesmen in the new imperial government. They carried their discipline into the classrooms, their honor into the institutions of the new Japan. They taught that service to one's nation was the same as service to one's lord, that Bushido could evolve with the times. But others could not accept the change. To them, the Meiji Restoration felt less like rebirth and more like betrayal. The Japan they had known, the world of oaths, hierarchy, and devotion, was slipping away. Among those who struggled with this new reality was Saigo Takamori, a man born of both courage and sorrow. He had once stood beside the leaders who restored the emperor to power. He had believed that modern Japan could preserve the heart of its past. But as reforms deepened and the traditions of his ancestors were cast aside, his faith began to waver. He withdrew to his home in Satsuma, surrounded by mountains and silence. There, he watched the new government build its armies, its industries, its laws, and felt the distance grow between the spirit of Japan and its newfound strength. In his heart, a quiet storm began to rise. He did not long for conquest, nor dream of revenge. He longed only for integrity, for a balance between progress and purpose. And when it became clear that such a balance was slipping away, he chose to stand for what he believed remained sacred. In 1877, in the hills of Kyushu, he and his followers, many of them former samurai, took up their old swords once more. It was not a fight for power, but for remembrance. They wished to remind Japan that honor, humility, and service must not be lost in the rush toward modernity. They knew they could not prevail. They knew their time had passed, but they believed that a life without principle was no life at all. The government's army, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, surrounded them. When the smoke cleared, Saigo Takamori and his companions were gone. With them, the era of the samurai ended. Yet even in defeat, his name became legend. The people called him the last samurai, not because he fought against progress, but because he stood for dignity in the face of change. He became a symbol of integrity, a reminder that honor does not belong to the past, but to the choices we make when the world turns against us. After his death, Japan continued to transform. Railways crossed the islands. Factories filled the cities. A new generation grew up knowing only the hum of modern life. But beneath the machinery and the noise, the old spirit of Bushido remained. It hid in the quiet gestures of respect, in the work ethic of craftsmen, in the reverence for discipline and detail. The samurai had vanished from the streets, but they had not vanished from Japan. They had become part of its foundation, silent, unseen, but enduring. Every nation carries within it the echoes of its past. For Japan, those echoes are the calm voice of the warrior. Do not rush. Do not forget who you are. Walk the path with clarity and let your actions speak for your spirit. The Meiji era had changed everything, and yet, in the stillness of its aftermath, the samurai lived on, no longer as men, but as memory, as lesson, as light. Long after the armor was set aside and the battlefields were reclaimed by grass and silence, something of the samurai remained. Not their swords, nor their banners, nor their castles, but the invisible discipline that had once guided their every breath. The rhythm of their way of life did not vanish with time. It transformed, echoing softly through the modern age. In the new Japan that rose from the ashes of change, the spirit of Bushido found new homes. Factories replaced fortresses, and pens replaced swords, but the same quiet dedication endured. Where the samurai once stood guard over their lords, now workers stood devoted to their craft, teachers to their students, and artists to their art. The duty to serve had not died. It had simply changed its shape. The businessman who rises before dawn to perfect his presentation, the athlete who trains in solitude long after the crowd is gone, the musician who plays the same passage until it becomes effortless. Each of them carries something of that old discipline, not as burden, but as clarity. The Japanese call it shokunin kishitsu, the craftsman's spirit. It is the idea that one's work, no matter how humble, deserves absolute attention. A sushi chef spends a lifetime perfecting the cut of a single fish. A gardener tends moss with the same reverence a monk gives to scripture. A calligrapher draws one character 1,000 times until the brush becomes an extension of the soul. These are not remnants of the past. They are the samurai's way reborn in gentler form. The sword, too, lives on not as a weapon, but as a symbol. It reminds those who see it that mastery comes through patience, and that precision is an act of respect. The same balance that once guided warriors now guides engineers and artists, architects and artisans. The same silence before a duel lives in the silence before a concert, or before a sculptor makes the first strike of the chisel. In martial arts dojos across Japan, students bow before entering the mat. They move slowly, deliberately, their breathing measured, their focus unwavering. Each step, each stance, is a lesson in humility. They are taught that victory means nothing without character, and that the greatest opponent is always the self. This, too, is the echo of Bushido, the art of becoming through awareness. Even in the crowded heart of Tokyo, where neon lights replace lanterns and the city hums with ceaseless motion, the echo remains. In the way a commuter stands in perfect line, in the polite bow exchanged between strangers, in the soft apology for a slight mistake. These small courtesies, unnoticed by many, are threads that tie the modern world to an ancient silence. Writers, filmmakers, and philosophers have carried that silence outward. The samurai's restraint has become a metaphor for dignity in the face of chaos. The code of Bushido has inspired ideals of honor and integrity far beyond Japan's shores. In a world that often celebrates noise and haste, the calm of the samurai stands as quiet defiance, a reminder that true strength never needs to shout. But even within Japan, this echo is not merely nostalgia. It is alive in classrooms where students clean their own desks, learning humility through action, in companies that value loyalty and collective harmony, in the meticulous care with which everyday things are made a teacup, a brush, a wooden door. Every act of attention is a bow to the past. And yet, the modern echo is not perfect. Just as the samurai themselves once struggled between ideal and reality, so too does the modern world wrestle with balance between progress and peace, between ambition and awareness. To live by the spirit of Bushido today is to seek harmony in a world that has forgotten stillness. It is to choose integrity when no one is watching, to pause before speaking, to listen more than to act. The samurai have long vanished from history's stage, but their echo continues in the sound of brushstrokes, in the footsteps of early morning workers, in the silence of shrines that still stand in city corners. You can feel it in the way the wind moves through the bamboo groves of Kyoto, in the bow of a monk sweeping temple steps, in the patience of a craftsman shaping something that will outlast him. The echo is not loud. It does not command attention. It simply waits in the quiet places of the heart, reminding us that strength is gentleness mastered, and that honor, at its truest, is awareness lived. The samurai no longer guard the land, but they still guard the spirit, through art, through mindfulness, through the grace of every deliberate act. And as long as there are hands that work with care, minds that seek balance, and hearts that bow before the moment, the samurai will never be gone. The age of the samurai ended not with a roar, but with silence. No armies marched, no banners burned. The last of their kind laid down their swords, and the world moved on. Yet the spirit they carried, the quiet strength, the grace in discipline, the dignity in restraint, refused to disappear. It sank into the soul of the nation, like ink absorbed by paper. The samurai were gone, but Bushido remained. The way of the warrior had always been more than the art of war. It was a philosophy of balance, of living with clarity, of acting with intention, of facing both triumph and loss with the same calm heart. Its wisdom did not fade with time. It simply found new forms. You can still see it in the rhythm of modern Japan, in the craftsman who spends decades perfecting a single technique, in the gardener who shapes each tree with care and patience, knowing he will never see its final form, in the student who bows before the classroom, honoring knowledge as something sacred. The old ways breathe quietly through every gesture of respect, every act of dedication, every unspoken apology. The sword, once a tool of defense, became a symbol of integrity. A samurai's blade was more than metal, it was his mirror. It reflected his discipline, his thoughts, his very being. Even today, the katana stands as a living symbol of purity and focus. To polish it was to polish the soul. To draw it without cause was to betray one's essence. In the centuries after their fall, artists, writers, and philosophers rediscovered the samurai spirit. They wrote not of battles, but of values. They found poetry in silence and strength in simplicity. The teachings of Hagakure, written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century, spoke of acceptance and awareness. The way of the warrior is found in death. He wrote not in the seeking of it, but in the readiness for it. To live each day as if it were one's last was to live fully, awake to every breath, every sound, every fleeting beauty. Bushido also spoke of compassion, a virtue often forgotten. It taught that true strength must always serve, that courage without mercy is emptiness. To act with honor was to protect not only one's lord, but the balance of all things. The samurai understood that to be strong is not to dominate, but to preserve harmony. In the modern world, these lessons have found new homes. They live in the discipline of martial artists, in the quiet concentration of calligraphers, in the precision of engineers, and in the courtesy of strangers on a crowded train. Each bow, each apology, each moment of patience carries the echo of 1,000 years. When Japan opened to the world, the image of the samurai became a bridge between cultures. Western philosophers admired their devotion to principle. Writers compared their restraint to the chivalry of medieval knights, though the two were never quite the same. The knight fought for faith, the samurai fought for balance. The knight's honor was tied to his god, the samurai's to his conscience. In art and cinema, their image traveled far beyond Japan's shores. Filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa reimagined the ancient warrior not as a relic, but as a timeless archetype, the lone figure who stands between chaos and order, between right and wrong, asking for nothing in return. From these stories, the samurai became universal, a symbol for anyone who walks a path of integrity in a world that forgets its meaning. But beyond the images, beyond the myths, lies something quieter and more profound. The true legacy of the samurai is mindfulness. They remind us that the smallest act, done with sincerity, can hold the weight of a lifetime. That one moment of stillness can reveal more than 1,000 words. That peace, in the end, is not given by the world it is cultivated within. Even now, in the modern cities of Japan, you can find traces of them. In a temple at dawn, where incense curls into the first light, in the sound of a bamboo fountain releasing its measured rhythm into the garden, in a craftsman's steady hands, in the quiet bow of a teacher to their students. The world changes, but reverence remains. The lessons of the samurai are not about death, they are about awareness. To live without fear, to act without hesitation, to face each day as an opportunity to serve something greater than oneself. In this way, every person can walk the way of the warrior, no matter their life or calling. For the samurai, perfection was never the goal. The path itself was the purpose. Every action, every thought, every silence was a chance to return to balance. To live by that awareness was to be free, even in duty. To lose that awareness was to be bound, even in victory. And so, though their armor has rusted and their castles fallen, the samurai remain, not in history books, but in the quiet strength of people who live with integrity, not in war, but in art, in compassion, and in the discipline of the everyday. Their story teaches that time cannot erase what is lived with purpose, that even as centuries pass, the calm of the warrior's heart can still be felt in the stillness between breaths, in the patience of creation, in the courage to live truthfully in an unsteady world. They remind us that every moment is a blade waiting to be sharpened, every choice a chance to define honor, and every silence a place where peace can begin. The samurai are gone, yet their spirit endures quiet, unseen, eternal. It waits not in temples or legends, but in the heart that chooses calm over anger, clarity over chaos, truth over illusion. The way of the warrior is not about fighting, it is about living, And as long as there are those who live with awareness, with kindness, and with purpose, the samurai will never truly fade. Night descends softly over the islands of Japan. The mountains fade into shadow, and the air grows still. A temple bell rings in the distance, its sound drifting like a memory across the valleys. Somewhere, beneath the quiet moon, a single leaf falls, and for a moment, time stands still. This is how the story of the samurai ends. Not with triumph, not with sorrow, but with peace. Their blades are sheathed, their armor asleep beneath the earth, their names scattered across the centuries. Yet their presence remains faint as incense, steady as breath, invisible but never gone. The samurai were never only warriors. They were mirrors of the human spirit, disciplined, flawed, devoted, aware. They taught that to live with clarity is to live fully, that the greatest strength lies not in the sword, but in restraint. They believed that every sunrise was a lesson, every sunset a meditation on impermanence. They understood that life is fragile and therefore sacred. As we look back upon their story, we see more than history. We see reflection. The echo of Bushido is not confined to the past. It is a path that still winds through the heart of those who listen. It whispers, be present, be humble, act with care, serve with sincerity. In the quiet homes of Edo, the samurai practiced calmness as others practiced art. They learned to speak through silence, to act through stillness. When they bowed, it was not out of fear, but out of respect for others, for the moment, for life itself. In that gesture lives the essence of their legacy. To bow is to acknowledge the fleeting nature of all things. To bow is to remember that honor lies not in being higher, but in lowering oneself to the world. Even now, you can find them in the hush before dawn, in the measured sound of bamboo fountains, in the precision of a calligrapher's hand. They are in the patience of a craftsman, in the discipline of an artist, in the calm voice of a teacher who guides without pride. The spirit of the samurai lingers in the quiet spaces between words, in the breath before action, in the dignity of a single, mindful choice. The world around us changes endlessly. Empires rise and fall. Machines replace hands. Noise fills the places where silence once lived. But the lessons of the samurai remain steady. To live with balance, to honor the small moments, to walk through life as if every step were sacred ground. There is a story told by Zen monks. A student once asked his master, "When the sword rusts and the world forgets our names, what remains?" The master smiled and replied, "The hand that polished the sword is still clean." The samurai understood this truth. It is not the weapon that defines the warrior, but the purity of his intention. Their way was a path of awareness to see clearly, to act without hesitation, to meet joy and sorrow with the same steady gaze. And though their world has passed into dust, their clarity endures, like the reflection of the moon in still water. You can touch it, but never hold it. You can see it, but it leaves no mark. As you listen now, imagine the gardens of Kyoto at dusk. The lanterns flicker. The scent of pine drifts through the air. A soft rain begins to fall. Somewhere, a monk strikes a bell, its tone expanding into eternity. In that sound lives everything: the rise and fall of empires, the breath of a single life, the whisper of every samurai who ever lived and ever served. The way of the warrior is not gone. It is quiet, waiting, alive in those who seek peace through purpose. It calls to anyone who walks with care, who chooses truth over ease, who honors silence as much as speech. It is not a code of battle, but a way of being. It reminds us that every life is both a duty and a gift. The samurai have returned to the wind, to the earth, to the gentle turning of the seasons. Their voices are no longer heard, but their lesson endures. Live fully, live simply, live with integrity. And when the last note of the flute fades into silence, when the night grows deep and the world drifts into sleep, their spirit remains. In the calm of your breath, in the stillness of your thoughts, in the space between heartbeats. For in that space, there is no past, no future, no fear. There is only awareness. There is only peace. And there in the quiet, the samurai still walk,